The fire had taken everything from Grace Ashford except her life, and some days she wondered if that was a mercy or a curse. She stood before the cracked mirror in the boarding house room, studying the raised pink scars that stretched from her left temple down across her cheek and jaw, disappearing beneath the collar of her dress to map a twisted path across her shoulder and upper arm. The barn fire 3 years ago in Kansas had killed her parents and destroyed her childhood home, leaving her with these permanent marks and a heart that had learned to expect rejection. "You should be grateful you survived," her aunt had said when Grace finally healed enough to leave the doctor's care. But her aunt's eyes had never quite met hers after that, always sliding away to focus on something else, anything else. Within 6 months, her aunt had arranged for Grace to take a position as a seamstress in Weaverville, California, far enough away that the family wouldn't have to look at her anymore. Grace was 22 now, living in a small room above the general store where she worked mending clothes and sewing dresses for the town's women. Most of them were kind enough, though they rarely lingered to chat. The men looked through her as if she were made of glass, their gazes skittering away from her scarred face. She had learned to keep her head down, her damaged side turned away, her hands busy with needle and thread. It was a Thursday morning in May of 1885 when Owen Garrett rode into town, his horse limping badly. Grace was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store when she heard the commotion. A tall man with sun-darkened skin and dust coating his leather vest was leading a paint horse toward the livery, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. The horse was clearly favoring its right front leg, and the man's face was creased with worry. "Easy now, Jasper. We will get you fixed up," he said, his voice carrying that particular cadence of someone who had spent more time talking to horses than people. Grace watched for a moment, then returned to her sweeping. Cowboys came and went through Weaverville regularly, heading to and from the mining operations in the mountains. This one would be no different, but Owen Garrett proved to be different in ways Grace couldn't have anticipated. He stayed in town while his horse recovered from a stone bruise, taking a room at the same boarding house where Grace lived. She first spoke to him 3 days after his arrival, when he came into the general store needing a shirt repaired. The seam along the shoulder had split, and he held it out to her with an apologetic expression. "Caught it on a fence post," he explained. "I know it is not pretty, but I was hoping you might be able to make it wearable again." Grace took the shirt, keeping her scarred left side angled away from him out of habit. "I can fix it by tomorrow afternoon." "That would be mighty appreciated." He didn't leave immediately, instead glancing around the store with genuine interest. "This is a nice town you have here, peaceful." "It serves its purpose," Grace said, already turning away to place the shirt with her other mending projects. She expected him to leave then, the transaction complete, but he lingered. "I am Owen Garrett, by the way. From Wyoming originally, though I have been working ranches all over for the past few years." Grace hesitated, then offered a small nod. "Grace Ashford. Pleased to meet you, Miss Ashford." There was a warmth in his voice that made her glance up despite herself. When she did, she found him looking directly at her face, not flinching or looking away from her scars. His eyes were a clear gray blue, like winter sky, and they held nothing but friendly interest. Grace quickly looked down again, unsure what to make of it. "Your shirt will be ready tomorrow," she repeated, making it clear the conversation was over. This time he took the hint and left, the bell above the door chiming as he went. That night, Grace lay in her narrow bed and thought about those gray-blue eyes. She had learned not to hope, not to imagine that anyone might see past her scars to whatever remained of the girl she had been before the fire. Hope was dangerous. It led to disappointment, to the kind of pain that cut deeper than any burn. The next afternoon, Owen returned for his shirt. Grace had done meticulous work on it, reinforcing not just the torn seam but checking all the others for weakness. It was more than he had paid for, but she took pride in her work regardless of the customer. "This is excellent," Owen said, examining the repair. "Better than it was when I bought it new. You have a real talent." "Thank you." Grace counted out his change, keeping the transaction brisk and professional. "Miss Ashford, I was wondering if you might join me for dinner this evening at the hotel restaurant, as a thank you for the fine work." The request was so unexpected that Grace's hands froze over the coins. She looked up at him sharply, searching for the trick, the cruel joke that must be hiding behind the invitation. But his expression was open and earnest, holding nothing but genuine interest. "I do not think that would be appropriate," she said carefully. "Why not? It is just dinner." Grace felt heat rising in her cheeks, the scarred side of her face feeling tight and obvious. "Mr. Garrett, I appreciate the offer, but I am not the kind of woman men take to dinner." His brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "I do not understand." She gestured to her face with a quick, almost angry movement. "Look at me. Really look." "I am looking," he said simply. "I see a woman who does beautiful work, who has kind eyes, and who I would very much like to have dinner with. Unless you are married or spoken for, in which case I apologize for the presumption. I am not married." The words came out sharper than she intended, but I am not interested in being someone's charity case or amusement. Something flickered across Owen's face then, a flash of understanding followed by what looked like determination. "Miss Ashford, I may not know you well, but I can tell you are not a woman who suffers fools, so I will be plain with you. I asked you to dinner because I find you intriguing, and I would like to know you better. It has nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the fact that you are the first person in this town who has not tried to sell me something or ask me for something. You just do your work and do it well, and I admire that. But if you would rather I leave you alone, I will respect that wish." Grace stared at him, her heart beating too fast. Part of her wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that someone might actually see her as more than her scars. But the larger, more cautious part remembered every disappointed look, every whispered comment, every man who had made it clear she was not worth their time. "I should get back to work," she said finally. Owen nodded, accepting the rejection with grace. "I understand. But the offer stands, should you change your mind. I will be in town at least another week while Jasper heals." He left then, and Grace stood in the empty store feeling a confusing mix of relief and regret. She told herself she had made the right choice, the safe choice. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at her without flinching, without pity, as if her scars were just another part of her face rather than the defining feature. The next Sunday, Grace attended the morning service at the small church on the edge of town. She always sat in the back pew on the left side, positioned so her scarred side faced the wall. It was a routine she had perfected over the past 2 years, a way to be part of the community while remaining invisible. Owen Garrett walked into the church just as the opening hymn began, and he scanned the pews before his eyes landed on her. To her surprise and dismay, he made his way directly to her pew and sat down beside her, on her left side, the scarred side she always kept hidden. Grace tensed, waiting for him to realize his mistake and move, but he simply opened the hymnal and began to sing in a pleasant baritone. Throughout the service, Grace was acutely aware of his presence. He didn't stare at her scars, didn't make a show of ignoring them either. He simply existed beside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When the service ended and people began filing out, Owen turned to her with a smile. Beautiful sermon, he said. Reverend Thompson has a way with words. Yes, Grace managed, gathering her things and preparing to flee. Miss Ashford, I wonder if you might walk with me for a bit. It is a lovely day, and I have been cooped up in town all week. I could use the company of someone who knows the area. I really should be getting back. Please. The word was simple but sincere. Just a short walk. I promise I am not as insufferable as I probably seem. Against her better judgment, Grace found herself nodding. They walked out of the church together, and she could feel the eyes of the congregation on them, could practically hear the whispers starting. Owen seemed oblivious to it all, pointing out a hawk circling overhead and commenting on the way the mountains looked in the morning light. They walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land, and the creek ran cold and clear from the high country. Owen found a fallen log and gestured for Grace to sit. She did, keeping space between them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I have upset you, Owen said after a moment of silence. That was not my intention. You did not upset me, Grace said, though it wasn't entirely true. I just do not understand what you want from me. Honestly, I want to know you. I want to understand the story behind those sad eyes and that careful way you hold yourself, like you are trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. Grace looked away, fighting the burn of tears. You do not know anything about me. That is why I am asking. Owen's voice was gentle but persistent. Grace, I am not a complicated man. I say what I mean and I mean what I say. When I look at you, I see someone who has been hurt and has decided the best way to avoid more hurt is to push people away. I understand that. I do. But I also think you deserve better than a life spent hiding. You have no idea what you are talking about. The words came out harsh, defensive. Then tell me, help me understand. Grace took a shaky breath, her hands clenching in her lap. Something about his quiet persistence, his refusal to be deterred, cracked something open inside her. The scars, she said finally. People tell you they do not matter, that it is what is inside that counts. But they are lying. The scars matter to everyone. They make people uncomfortable. They make me unmarriageable, unemployable in any position where I might be seen. My own family sent me away because they could not stand to look at me anymore. That says more about them than it does about you, Owen said quietly. Does it? Grace turned to face him fully, letting him see the full extent of the damage. Look at me, Mr. Garrett. Really look. This is what I am. This is all I will ever be. A scarred woman that men look through and children stare at and other women pity. So forgive me if I do not believe your kind words and your dinner invitations, because I have learned that hope is just another word for disappointment. Owen was quiet for a long moment, his gray-blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made Grace want to look away. But she held his gaze, defiant, waiting for him to admit the truth and leave her alone. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and gently traced the line of scarring along her jaw with his fingertip. Grace froze, shocked by the touch, by the tenderness of it. I see a woman who survived something terrible, Owen said softly. I see strength and resilience. I see someone who gets up every morning and faces a world that has been cruel to her, and she does it with grace and dignity. And yes, I see scars. But Grace, scars are just proof that you fought and won. They are not shameful. They are not ugly. They are part of your story, and I would very much like to know that story, if you will let me. Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. No one had touched her scars with anything but clinical detachment since the doctors finished their work. No one had called them anything but tragic or unfortunate or poor thing. Owen's words, his touch, undid something fundamental in her careful defenses. I do not know how to do this, she whispered. Do what? believe that someone might actually want to know me." Owen smiled, and it transformed his whole face, making him almost handsome in a rough, weathered way. "That is all right. We can figure it out together. How about we start with that dinner, tomorrow evening if you are willing?" Grace found herself nodding before she could overthink it, before the fear could rise up and choke her again. "Tomorrow evening. Good." Owen stood and offered his hand to help her up. Grace took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. "I will meet you at the hotel at 6 o'clock. The next day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Grace changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue calico with a high collar that covered most of the scarring on her neck and shoulder. She brushed her hair until it shone, then carefully arranged it to partially cover the left side of her face. Then she felt foolish for hiding and pinned it back again. By the time she walked to the hotel, her stomach was tied in knots. Owen was waiting outside, dressed in clean trousers and a pressed shirt. His face lit up when he saw her, and he offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "You look beautiful," he said, and the simple honesty in his voice made Grace's cheeks flush. Dinner was a revelation. Owen asked her about her work, about the books she liked to read, about her opinions on everything from the best way to cook beans to whether California would ever feel like home. He listened to her answers with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions, sharing his own thoughts and experiences. Grace found herself relaxing, talking more freely than she had in years. "I always wanted to own my own dress shop," she admitted over dessert. "Not just mending, but creating new designs. I have notebooks full of sketches, patterns I have worked out." "Why do not you do it?" Owen asked. Grace gestured to her face. "Who would want to buy dresses from someone who looks like me? A dress shop requires customers to come in to spend time with you. I make people uncomfortable." "You do not make me uncomfortable. You are one person, Mr. Garrett." "Owen, please." "And I think you are underestimating people. Yes, there are small-minded folks everywhere. But there are also good people who care more about quality work and fair prices than what the seamstress looks like." Grace wanted to believe him, but years of experience had taught her otherwise. Still, it was nice to imagine, just for a moment, that he might be right. They began spending time together regularly after that first dinner. Owen would walk with her after church, join her for lunch at the boarding house, sit in the general store and talk while she worked on her mending. The town noticed, of course. Grace could feel the speculation, the curiosity, the occasional disapproval. But Owen seemed immune to it all, treating her with the same steady kindness and interest regardless of who was watching. 3 weeks after Owen had arrived in Weaverville, Grace realized with a start that she was falling in love with him. It happened gradually, in small moments. The way he remembered she liked her coffee with extra sugar, how he brought her wildflowers he found on his walks, the sound of his laugh when she said something that amused him. But it crystallized one afternoon when he found her crying in the back room of the general store. Mrs. Henderson had come in that morning, a wealthy woman whose opinion carried weight in town. She had taken one look at Grace and declared that she would be taking her business elsewhere, that she could not trust her fine dresses to someone with such unfortunate disfigurement. The store owner, Mr. Collins, had tried to smooth things over, but Mrs. Henderson had been loud in her disgust, and half the town had heard. Grace had held herself together until her lunch break, then retreated to the back room and let the tears come. She was so tired of being judged, of being found wanting, of having her skills and her worth dismissed, because of something she could not control. Owen found her there, having stopped by with sandwiches from the boarding house. He took one look at her tear-stained face and set the food aside, pulling her into his arms without a word. Grace stiffened at first, shocked by the embrace, but then she let herself lean into his solid warmth, let herself be held while she cried. "What happened?" he asked when she finally pulled back, wiping at her eyes. Grace told him, the whole humiliating encounter spilling out in angry, hurt words. Owen listened, his jaw tightening, his eyes growing hard. "Mrs. Henderson is a fool," he said flatly when she finished. "And she is missing out on the best seamstress in California. It does not matter if I am good at what I do if no one will hire me. Then stop waiting for them to hire you. Start your own shop like you wanted." "I cannot afford that. I barely make enough to pay for my room." Owen was quiet for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "I have savings, money I have been setting aside for years, planning to buy my own ranch someday. Let me invest in your shop." "What? No, Owen, I could never accept that." "Why not? It is a good investment. You are talented, you have a vision, and you work harder than anyone I know. I believe in you, Grace. I believe you could make this work." Grace shook her head, overwhelmed. "You barely know me. You have been here less than a month. Why would you risk your savings on me?" Owen reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his palms warm against her cheeks, his thumbs gently brushing the ridges of her scars. "Because I am in love with you," he said simply. "I think I have been since the moment you looked at me in this store and told me your name. And I want to be part of building your future if you will let me." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "You cannot love me. Too late." His smile was soft, tender. "I already do." "Owen, this is crazy. You do not really know me. Once the novelty wears off, once you really think about what it would mean to be with someone who looks like me, you will change your mind. Everyone does." Instead of arguing, Owen leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, soft and sweet, and Grace felt something inside her chest crack wide open. When he pulled back, his eyes were serious. "I am going to kiss every scar on your face," he said quietly. "And I am going to keep doing it until you believe that I mean what I say." He started with the line along her temple, pressing a tender kiss to the raised tissue. Then her cheekbone, her jaw, the corner of her mouth where the scarring pulled her lips slightly to one side. Each kiss was deliberate, reverent, as if he were trying to pour all his feeling into the touch. Grace stood frozen, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were different tears. "You are beautiful," Owen murmured between kisses. "You are strong and talented and kind, and I am the luckiest man alive that you are letting me close enough to know you." "I am scared," Grace whispered. "I am so scared of believing this is real and then having it taken away." "I know. But Grace, fear is just going to steal the joy from right now. I cannot promise the future will be perfect. Life does not work that way. But I can promise that I will wake up every morning choosing you, choosing us. That is all any of us can do." Grace reached up and covered his hands with hers, holding them against her face. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I think I have been trying not to since that first day." Owen kissed her again, deeper this time, and Grace let herself fall into it, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be real. Over the next several months, Grace's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. Owen stayed in Weaverville, taking work at a nearby ranch to earn money while Grace used his savings to set up a small dress shop. She rented a storefront on Main Street, painted the walls a cheerful yellow, and filled the windows with her best work. The shop opened in August of 1885 with a modest celebration and a surprising number of customers. Not everyone was supportive. Mrs. Henderson made her disapproval clear, and several other women followed her lead. But there were also women who saw Grace's talent and did not care about her appearance. Slowly, steadily, the shop built a reputation for quality work at fair prices. Grace hired 2 other women to help with the basic mending, freeing her up to focus on creating custom pieces. Owen proposed on a Sunday afternoon in September, by the creek where they had first really talked. He had been working extra hours at the ranch, and Grace had worried he was having second thoughts about their relationship. Instead, he produced a simple gold band and got down on one knee in the grass. "Grace Ashford, I know we have not been together long by traditional standards, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are my best friend, my partner, my love. Will you marry me?" Grace said yes before he even finished the question, and they held each other in the fading light, making plans for their future. They were married in November in the same church where Owen had first sat beside her. Grace wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had designed herself, with long sleeves and a high collar that covered most of her scars. Owen wore a new suit and looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The reception was held at the hotel, and nearly the whole town came. There were still people who disapproved, who whispered about the scarred seamstress, and the cowboy who had been fool enough to marry her. But there were far more people who celebrated with genuine happiness, who had come to respect Grace's skill and Owen's steadfast devotion. Late in the evening, after the dancing and the cake and the well wishes, Owen and Grace retired to their room at the boarding house. They had rented a small house on the edge of town and would move in the following week, but for tonight, this was home. Owen was gentle and patient, taking his time to explore every inch of Grace's body, kissing not just her facial scars but the ones that spread across her shoulder and down her arm, the ones on her ribs and hip where the burning debris had fallen. He touched her like she was precious, like she was whole, and Grace felt something deep inside her finally heal. "I love you," she whispered in the darkness, his arms warm around her. "I love you too," Owen said. "Always." The next years were not always easy, but they were good. The dress shop thrived, becoming known throughout the region for Grace's innovative designs and excellent craftsmanship. Owen eventually saved enough to buy a small ranch just outside town, where he raised horses and cattle. They built a life together, piece by piece, day by day. There were still hard moments. Grace still occasionally encountered people who stared or made cruel comments. There were days when she looked in the mirror and saw only the scars, when the old fears and insecurities rose up to choke her. But Owen was always there, steadfast and loving, reminding her of her worth until she could see it again herself. In the spring of 1887, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She worried about passing on some weakness to her child, worried about being judged as a mother, worried about everything. Owen held her through the fears and celebrated with her through the joy. Their son was born in December of that year, a healthy baby boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Owen's father, and Grace thought her heart might burst from the love she felt holding him. "He is perfect," Owen said, looking down at his son with wonder. "Just like his mother." "His mother is covered in scars," Grace said, but without bitterness. She had learned to carry them differently now, to see them as Owen did, as proof of survival rather than marks of shame. "His mother is the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known," Owen corrected. "And he is lucky to have her." Samuel grew into a bright, curious child. Grace worried at first about how he would react to her appearance, whether he would be ashamed of having a scarred mother. But children, she discovered, were beautifully uncomplicated. To Samuel, she was simply Mama, and her scars were just part of who she was. When he was 4 years old and asked about them, she told him the truth, that she had been in a fire, that she had been hurt but had healed, and that the scars were a reminder that she was strong enough to survive. "Like armor," Samuel said seriously, tracing the line along her jaw with a chubby finger. "Like a soldier." "Yes," Grace agreed, her throat tight with emotion. "Like armor." In 1890, Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's easy laugh, and she completed their family in a way Grace had not known was missing. The house on the ranch grew over the years, expanded to hold their growing family and the life they were building. The dress shop continued to succeed, and Grace eventually hired enough staff that she could work from home several days a week, designing new patterns while keeping an eye on her children. She published a small book of her designs in 1892, which sold surprisingly well and led to orders from as far away as San Francisco. Owen's ranch also prospered. He had a gift for working with horses, and his reputation grew. Men came from all over to buy his trained mounts. He worked hard but always made time for his family, teaching Samuel to ride and reading bedtime stories to Rose and falling into bed exhausted and happy beside Grace each night. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1895, Owen took Grace back to the creek where he had proposed. The children were spending the night with a neighbor, giving them a rare evening alone. They sat on the same fallen log, now weathered and moss-covered, and watched the water flow past. "You remember what you told me the first time we sat here?" Owen asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "I told you that hope was just another word for disappointment," Grace said quietly. "You still believe that?" Grace thought about the past 10 years, about all the ways her life had expanded and deepened. She thought about her thriving business, her beautiful children, this man who loved her so completely. She thought about the ways she had learned to stand taller, to take up space in the world, to see herself through his eyes until she finally learned to see herself with her own. "No," she said. "I was wrong. Hope is not about avoiding disappointment. It is about believing in possibility even when you have been hurt, and you taught me that." Owen kissed her temple, right over the scar that started there. "You taught yourself. I just loved you until you were ready to believe it." That makes it sound simple. Maybe it is simple. Not easy, but simple. Love someone, show up for them, choose them every day. The rest works itself out. Grace leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steadiness that had become her anchor. "I love you, Owen Garrett. More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too, Grace. Always have, always will." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Grace thought about the girl she had been when she first came to Weaverville, broken and hiding, convinced she was unlovable. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. The scars were still there, of course. They would always be there, but they no longer defined her. She was a wife, a mother, a successful businesswoman, a friend to many in the town. She was loved and respected and valued. The scars were just part of her story now, not the whole story. Over the following years, Grace and Owen's life continued to unfold in beautiful and unexpected ways. Samuel grew into a thoughtful young man who shared his father's way with horses and his mother's creative spirit. Rose proved to be a gifted artist, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with drawings of the ranch and the mountains and her family. In 1898, Grace published a second book of dress designs, this one including patterns and instructions so that other seamstresses could create her pieces. It was a modest success, but more importantly, it connected her with women across the West who shared her passion for beautiful, practical clothing. Owen's parents came to visit in 1899, making the long journey from Wyoming. Grace had been nervous about meeting them, worried they would judge their son's choice of wife. But Owen's mother had taken one look at Grace, pulled her into a warm embrace, and said, Thank you for making my son so happy." They stayed for 2 months, and by the time they left, Grace felt like she had gained not just in-laws but true family. The turn of the century brought changes to Weaverville. The mining operations were declining and some families were moving away. But the town was also modernizing, with talk of electric lights and better roads. Grace's shop adapted, adding ready-made pieces alongside the custom work, finding new ways to serve the community. Through it all, Owen remained her constant. He still kissed her scars, still told her she was beautiful, still looked at her like she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And Grace, who had once thought herself unworthy of love, learned to receive it with grace and to give it back with equal measure. In 1902, Samuel married a local girl named Emily, a sweet-natured young woman who loved horses almost as much as he did. They built a small house on the ranch property, and Owen officially made Samuel a partner in the business. The ranch was growing, and Owen was happy to share the work and the success with his son. Rose, meanwhile, decided she wanted to study art in San Francisco. It was a bold choice for a young woman from a small town, and Grace remembered her own dreams of something bigger. She and Owen supported the decision, though it meant their daughter would be far from home. They saw her off on the train in the fall of 1903, both of them trying not to cry. "She has your courage," Owen said as the train pulled away, his arm around Grace's waist. "She has your stubbornness," Grace countered, but she was smiling through her tears. With both children grown and building their own lives, Grace and Owen found themselves entering a new phase. They were only in their early 40s, with years of life ahead of them, but the frantic busyness of raising children was behind them. Grace began taking on fewer projects at the shop, focusing only on the work that truly excited her. Owen hired more ranch hands, giving himself more time to simply enjoy the land and the animals rather than constantly working. They traveled some, taking trips to San Francisco to visit Rose, journeying to Wyoming to see Owen's parents. They spent long evenings on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. They made love with the freedom of people who no longer had to worry about children interrupting, relearning each other's bodies with the patience and skill of long practice. In 1905, Samuel and Emily had their first child, a daughter named Grace after her grandmother. Grace held her tiny namesake and felt the circle of life continuing, felt the legacy of love and strength passing to a new generation. Little Grace would grow up seeing her grandmother's scars as just another part of her, nothing shameful or strange, simply part of the family story. More grandchildren followed over the years. Rose married an artist she met in San Francisco and had twin boys who were as wild and creative as their mother. Samuel and Emily had 2 more children, a boy and another girl. The ranch house was often full of noise and laughter, children running through the rooms and playing in the yard while Grace and Owen watched with contentment. On a quiet evening in 1910, as they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, Grace and Owen sat on the porch watching their grandchildren chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Samuel and Emily were visiting with their children, and the house behind them was warm with light and life. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Grace asked. "If you had not come to Weaverville that day, if you had not been so stubborn about getting to know me?" Owen was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But then I realize that I cannot imagine any other life. This, right here, this is everything I ever wanted, even when I did not know I wanted it." "I told you once that I was too scarred to be loved," Grace said softly. "I remember. And I told you that you were wrong. You were right. But it took me a long time to believe it. Years, really. I kept waiting for you to wake up and realize you had made a mistake. Owen took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of her palm. The only mistake would have been letting you push me away. Grace, you taught me as much as I taught you. You showed me what real courage looks like. You showed me that love is not about finding someone perfect. It is about finding someone perfect for you and then choosing them every single day. I am grateful, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. For all of it. For you, for our children, for this life we built. Even for the scars, in a way, because they led me here. The scars are part of your story, Owen said, but they are not the whole story. The whole story is about a woman who refused to let the world make her small, who built a business and a family and a beautiful life, despite everything telling her she could not. The scars are just the prologue. Everything that came after is the real story. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their family, listening to the sounds of the evening. The grandchildren were being called inside for bed, protesting but obeying. Samuel and Emily stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the light, talking quietly. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied and Owen smiled at the sound. 25 years, Grace mused. It feels like a lifetime and like no time at all. Here is to 25 more, Owen said, raising an imaginary glass. At least, Grace agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Grace Garrett, formerly Ashford, thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the scared, scarred young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Weaverville all those years ago, convinced she was unlovable and worthless. She thought about the cowboy who had seen past her defenses to the woman beneath, who had kissed her scars and called them beautiful, who had loved her into wholeness. The scars were still there, of course. They would always be there, faded now with time but still visible. But they no longer hurt, no longer defined her. They were simply part of the map of her life, markers of where she had been and what she had survived. They were proof that she was strong enough to endure, brave enough to hope, and worthy enough to be loved. And that, Grace thought, was the real happy ending. Not that the scars disappeared or stopped mattering to others, but that they stopped mattering to her. She had learned to see herself the way Owen saw her, as a complete person, scarred but not broken, marked but not ruined, different but not less. The years continued to roll past, each one bringing new joys and challenges. There were difficult times, of course. Owen's parents passed away within a year of each other in 1912, and the grief hit him hard. Grace held him through it, returning the comfort he had so often given her. There were droughts that tested the ranch, economic downturns that affected the dress shop, the normal trials of life that no one escapes. But through it all, they had each other. And that, Grace learned, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In 1915, as they approached their 30th anniversary, Owen's health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing down, a persistent cough that would not quite go away. The doctor said his lungs were weak, likely from years of breathing in dust and smoke and all the harsh elements of ranch life. He prescribed rest and warmer climates, but Owen refused to leave the ranch. "This is my home," he told Grace firmly. "Our home. I am not spending my final years anywhere else." "Do not talk about final years," Grace said, though fear clutched at her heart. "You are only 52. We have plenty of time left." Owen just smiled and kissed her forehead, but Grace saw the knowledge in his eyes. They both knew he was not as strong as he had been, that the cough was getting worse rather than better. Grace threw herself into caring for him, cutting back on her shop hours to spend more time at home. She cooked nourishing meals, made sure he rested, sat with him on the porch in the afternoons when the air was warm and clear. They talked about everything: their children, their grandchildren, their memories of the past 30 years. They planned for the future, even as Grace feared that future might not include as much time as she wanted. On a spring morning in 1916, Owen woke Grace before dawn, shaking her shoulder gently. She came awake instantly, always alert to any change in his condition. "What is wrong? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Owen said, and his voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "Come outside with me. I want to see the sunrise." They bundled up in blankets and went out to the porch, sitting in their familiar chairs with the view of the mountains stretched out before them. The sky was just beginning to lighten, stars fading as the sun prepared to make its appearance. "You remember the first time we watched the sunrise together?" Owen asked, his hand finding hers under the blankets. "Of course. It was the week after we were married. You woke me up at an ungodly hour and dragged me outside. And you were furious," Owen said, laughing softly at the memory. "Until I saw how beautiful it was," Grace admitted. "Then I forgave you." They sat in silence, watching the light grow and spread across the sky. When the sun finally broke over the mountains, painting everything gold, Owen squeezed Grace's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For letting me love you, for loving me back, for building this life with me, for every morning, every sunset, every ordinary moment in between. Thank you for all of it." Grace felt tears on her cheeks. "Owen, I mean it, Grace. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, the very best thing. You saved me," Grace whispered. "When I thought I was beyond saving, you showed me I was wrong." "We saved each other," Owen corrected. "That is what love does." Owen passed away quietly 3 days later in his sleep, with Grace holding his hand. The grief was overwhelming, a physical pain that took her breath away. But even through the sorrow, Grace found comfort in the knowledge that they had loved each other well, that they had not wasted a single moment of their time together. The funeral was well attended, a testament to the lives Owen and Grace had built in Weaverville. Their children stood beside Grace, strong and supportive. Their grandchildren, ranging from young adults to small children, filled the church pews. The town mourned with them, remembering Owen's kindness and his unwavering devotion to his wife. In the months that followed, Grace learned how to be alone again. It was different this time, though. She was not the scared, scarred young woman who had arrived in Weaverville over 30 years ago. She was a woman who had been loved deeply and had loved deeply in return. She was a woman who had built a business, raised a family, and created a legacy. She continued running the dress shop with help from her staff, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of creation. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, becoming a vital part of their lives. She sat on the porch of the ranch house in the evenings and talked to Owen as if he were still beside her, sharing her day and her thoughts. And sometimes, late at night when she was alone, Grace would trace the scars on her face and remember the cowboy who had kissed them and called them beautiful. She would remember his gray-blue eyes and his steady voice, and the way he had loved her without reservation or condition. She would remember how he had proved wrong every person who had ever told her she was too scarred to be loved. Grace lived for many more years, long enough to see great-grandchildren born, to see the ranch continue to thrive under Samuel's management, to see Rose become a recognized artist with works shown in galleries across the West. She lived to see the world change, automobiles replacing horses, electric lights illuminating even small towns like Weaverville, women gaining the right to vote in 1920. Through it all, she carried Owen with her. Not as a burden of grief, though she missed him every day, but as a gift. He had given her the courage to believe in herself, the strength to claim her place in the world, the knowledge that she was worthy of love. And that gift continued to shape her life long after he was gone. When Grace finally passed away in her sleep in 1932, at the age of 69, she left behind a thriving business, a loving family, and a legacy of strength and resilience. At her funeral, her granddaughter stood and told the story of how Grace had survived a terrible fire, how she had been told she was too scarred to be loved, and how a stubborn cowboy named Owen had proved them all wrong. "My grandmother taught us that scars are not shameful," young Grace said, her voice strong and clear. "They are proof that we survived. They are maps of where we have been and reminders of our strength. She taught us that love sees past the surface to what is underneath. And she taught us that hope, real hope, is not about avoiding pain but about believing in possibility despite the pain." The family gathered after the service, sharing memories and stories. They talked about Grace's kindness and her creativity, her business sense and her devotion to family. They talked about the way she had loved Owen and the way he had loved her, a love story that had become family legend. And in the end, that was Grace's real legacy. Not the successful business or the published books of designs or even the large and loving family, though all of those mattered. Her real legacy was the proof that people who have been broken can heal, that scars do not define worth, and that love, real and true and steadfast, can transform everything. The cowboy had kissed every mark and proved them wrong. And in doing so, he had given Grace the greatest gift possible, the ability to see herself as worthy, to believe in her own value, to love and be loved without reservation. That was the story that lived on long after both of them were gone, a story of hope and healing and the transformative power of love that refuses to give up.